So hi, everyone. Welcome to the segment where we're featuring what we think are some of the best healthcare venture investors globally. I'm super excited to be interviewing with Payal. She's the partner at 46 Ventures. Payal, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into questions around why you're making investments in healthcare and some of your portfolio companies, let's just start so your audience has a baseline of who is 46 Ventures Fund, things that you look for, fund size, etc.
Sure. So 406, we've been around about 15 years, based in Boston, and focused in a few ways. I think the first is that we've got very particular segments, and so digital health, as we call it, is one of our core segments, and the other two are cybersecurity and data and cloud. So those are not vertical specific, and the digital health one is specific to healthcare. And I know we're going to talk a lot more about sort of our healthcare specific thesis moving forward, so I'll save that for later. We are also focused by stage. So we invest typically at the Series A stage, and that's sort of about 80% of our activity. And then we will seed or go even earlier in some rare occasions, most often for our repeat entrepreneurs, which we've been, sort of honored or humbled to have at this point in our sort of history. And so our typical check size will be like 2 to 7 million into the A. We will lead or co-lead that round, and then take a board seat and hopefully be very helpful, and then reserve capital for follow-on in all future rounds. And then to that point around being helpful, I think all of us have been, operators or entrepreneurs to some extent, or have been investing for a long time. So we hope to be sort of in the trenches with our entrepreneurs and really helpful where it is helpful. And sort of the last bits on the fund, we raised our fourth fund last year, which is a $300 million fund. We are managing about $1 billion of capital across 4 core funds and 2 opportunity funds. And the opportunity funds really allow us to sort of go the distance with our existing portfolio and invest, beyond just the core fund in the later stage rounds of our company. So we're really pleased with sort of where the platform is, at the stage 15 years in.
Incredible. I mean, it's a lot of cash. I'm curious, and you seem, you seem to really be focusing on digital health on behalf of 46 Ventures, and there's a lot. In healthcare space is extremely vast. First, it seems as though you start to fall into more healthcare services. And I'm just curious, why have you kind of fall into this direction? We'll go into more detail a little bit later, but generally from the outside looking in at the portfolio, it seems more healthcare service oriented.
Sure, yeah. So I'll take a step back and talk about our healthcare platform in general. So I do co-lead our segment with my colleague Liam Donahue, who's one of the founders of 406 Ventures. And our thesis in healthcare is investing in companies that improve the delivery of care and looking at either tech or tech-enabled services. So you will see across our portfolio companies that are pure tech or software, companies like a Redox, or you'll see companies that are pure services and delivering care specifically, like Iora or Wellbe Health, but you'll see a lot that's sort of in the middle, what we call tech-enabled services. So some element of novel and new disruptive technology, but then also some element of sort of services wrapper around that. And I really attribute our philosophy on that to Liam as sort of more of the storied healthcare investor. I came from tech, and so for me, it was really ascribing to sort of Liam's philosophy, which I'm now drinking the Kool-Aid on, which is, that in order to be disruptive in healthcare, which is ultimately a services industry, you have to provide some level of services. At the end of the day, healthcare is a people-to-people industry, and if you provide just pure technology for a particular category, it's really hard to move the needle, or it's really hard to get into the services workflow. So a lot of our companies end up providing some sort of services wrapper or element. So that's sort of the reason and rationale for the services. And I think it's made us unique in the marketplace because we understand services, we're not afraid of it. And we understand this sort of tech-enabled service realm, which I think is hard if you're just a native pure tech investor, or it can be a little bit challenging, excuse me, if you're just sort of a services investor. So there's a nice sort of combination between Liam and me as well, since I've got a lot of more history in tech and him more in healthcare services.
Awesome. Well, and maybe let's dive into a little bit further, because when I feel like a lot of not just venture investors, but all healthcare stakeholders can be pretty overwhelmed with just on the healthcare software solutions aside, whether it's the tech-enabled services or the tech itself. How do you filter healthcare-oriented services down? Like, are you going by disease and condition? Is this more like, what is the specific type of care generally? Or is this more like they have a great approach for service regardless of what condition? How do you take that ecosystem? It's so big, and just know that what direction to go.
Yeah, sure. And I think this goes a little bit back to focus. And by the way, I forgot to talk about sort of where our name derives. And I think that's part of it. So .406, which is Ted Williams' batting average in 1941, the highest ever achieved. He kind of said, look, I'm not going to just swing at everything that's in the strike zone. I'm going to map out probabilities of where I can get on base or get a home run and try to swing at those higher probability balls coming through the strike zone. So we too, I think for hopefully better from a returns perspective, not worse, are also saying we're going to be really disciplined, both at a fund level, but then also at a segment level, and try to invest in opportunities that are within our strike zone, within our strike zone. And so on the healthcare side, we only invest in companies that are selling to hospital systems or to payers or someone who bears the risk. So it's kind of this enterprise health thesis. So we don't do direct to consumer. We don't do companies that sell to pharma. We don't do med devices, therapeutics, diagnostics. So to leave that to sort of the smarter, more scientific folks. We're really in kind of this realm of care management and population health management. So that's sort of the first way that we filter, is by being, specific and deliberate about what we do and what we don't do. Now, within that, we keep a really strong ear to the ground to payers and health systems about what their top 5 priorities are at any given time. So we've got a strong network of sort of executives and decision makers there to make sure we know what they're thinking about. That sort of informs, where we should be paying attention. And then from a sort of thesis approach, we say, okay, what are big categories that are aligning with that are big spend or big problem categories? And then let's drill down to sort of subpopulations or subcategories and really find where there's white space for first, best, and only companies. Because remember, we're Series A, so we've got to be thinking sort of 2 to 3 years in advance where the puck is going. It can't be obvious per se right now. So I'll give you an example. One of our recent investments is Heartbeat Health, which is the first virtual care platform for cardiovascular disease. So a patient can end-to-end see a cardiologist entirely virtually and have appropriate and, in fact, terrific care for heart disease. And we made that investment in February. And of course, COVID made us look a little bit smarter in the sense that now things are shifting so much to virtual. But even before that, I think, we understood the cardiovascular disease, and it is a huge cost area for payers. There are elements of it in populations for whom it makes sense to deliver it virtually. So Heartbeat's not boiling the ocean, but they're really focused on the populations where you can move the needle with virtual care. And it's worth attempting and worth figuring this out because of all of the different elements of it and how big the potential is. And so that's where we kind of got conviction on that opportunity. And by the way, great sort of founding team, which is really critical. So that's kind of, and I think that's sort of how we're thinking. It's like, it's very early in virtual care in heart disease. Heartbeat is sort of the first, the best and only today, but that's how we sort of derive our investment theses. And then when you step back and sort of look at our portfolio, it kind of starts to make sense, because then you see companies across different disease states and populations and subpopulations. And then you see sort of the technologies that enable a lot of those companies as well, like Redox and Abacus and others. So that's how we think about it.
Yeah, that's a great way to filter it down. um, and you talked a little bit about it, but as an early stage investor, uh, even looking at investing in products that go directly towards payers or those who bear the risk, uh, how do you manage this idea? Are you looking for, as an early stage investor, does it affect your investment decision making? Are you looking for like moonshots? Or are you looking for something that's more practically applied in healthcare? Because it seems like healthcare is a challenging space to invest in compared to a lot of other enterprise software that you guys are in.
Yeah, and I think some of that can be fund specific. I think for us, it's a balance. I'd say we are looking for really disruptive ideas, but there's a lot of practicality to them, and there's a few elements of that. You know, every single one of our investments has strong hard dollar ROI. You know, when you sell to the customer and they pay $1, do they get $2 to $3 of some sort of value back? We're sort of maniacal about that, and I think so that makes it more practical and less moonshot, and that our companies are often able to demonstrate that, or at least the very early signs of it, so we can kind of draw that map forward. Because in healthcare, it's really hard to sell to the end customers unless you have that value prop. And so as much as we'd love to invest in, you know, moonshots, you may create the best product or tech ever, but if it doesn't have some of these foundational elements, it's going to, you know, die in the sales cycle of healthcare. So that's why we really focus on that. We're moonshot or not, we're really focused on founding teams that have lived and breathed the problem. Because again, healthcare is so complex and intricate. And so, you know, Heartbeat Health as an example, one of the co-founders and CEO, Jeff Wessler, is a cardiologist, you know, knows what it's like to take care of patients, right? And understands what part of that care can be delivered virtually or not, and understands the range of complexities across patient populations. So that's a good example. You know, the Redox team came out of Epic and had done Epic installations and Cerner installations and other installations across health systems and knew the interoperability problem before they started Redox. And so that's another sort of common theme where, you know, whether it's going to be a moonshot or not, which I think one would say Redox was at the time that we invested, when people were like, what do you mean you're going to make, you know, all EMRs talk to each other and all of that? You know, I think there's some sort of core practical elements that we look for. And then I think the last thing I'll say is our strategy is to not spray and pray, as we call it. So we make about 24 investments per fund. So each investment is really important. Each investment really matters. So, you know, we hope for huge outcomes and sort of moonshot outcomes, but at the end of the day, we have to make these companies work. So we try to limit, you know, the number of investments that we make and be really, you know, disciplined on that, so that we can help these companies sort of achieve their, you know, moonshot or ambitious sort of goals. So that's sort of the, you know, kind of long-winded way of answering sort of, you know, moonshot or
No, that's great, because I think it's hard to kind of bridge that gap, because healthcare, like you mentioned, is so difficult to sell into. And if the end product doesn't get it right, even if the science is amazing, you know, if you can't sell to the ecosystem, it's going to be impossible.
And sometimes it's sort of the simple ideas that, I mean, we're still so nascent in healthcare technology adoption that it doesn't take right now the moonshots to create, you know, great companies that move the needle on care and outcomes and spend, right? And we're really, I think a lot of our investments are focused on very sort of basic patient needs right now. That's sort of where we are. I'm looking forward to sort of the next decade or two of being able to take more moonshots in healthcare, but I think right now we're still very much at the, you know, foundational level in terms of technology and technology adoption.
Interesting. And you kind of already answered this question, but I wanted to ask it again. But you know, earlier you talked about how the focus on, especially health services, was healthcare is a service industry, so you have to be a part of the service process in order to get into it. On top of that, you talked about how you have not only people on the ground that understand what are the most important things for a lot of healthcare providers that they're looking at, and how to prioritize different verticals that you go into. And then also, you mentioned what is practical from a healthcare investment perspective. But I'm just curious, generally, it feels like you see something most people don't. And I'm curious, in healthcare, for you, what is, I mean, what you're making these bold bets on investing in a lot of great healthcare companies, being very specific with it. And so I'm just curious, what are those some things that you see that most people don't see in healthcare, and how's that kind of shaped that investment thesis?
Hmm. I'm honored to think that we that we see something that others don't. I think part of it is, and just sort of having been around as long as we have and sort of being really focused on healthcare, we do get to see a lot of the opportunities. And I do think part of the thesis-driven approach allows us to really filter into companies that are going to be, disruptive for enterprise health, and then we get to really pick, get the pick of the litter. But I think, our focus on, I'd reiterate a lot of, what I've already said, which I think is this maniacal focus on sort of either payer or provider facing companies, I think is sort of allowed us to be differentiated and see around corners or see things that others don't, because we're really laser focused on that, right? We're not a little distracted by sort of what are pharma's incentives or how are they thinking about it and where does sort of the drugs fit in. We're really kind of this tunnel vision around care delivery between those who provide care and those who bear the risk for care. And sometimes those people can be the same as payers and providers are converging, or sometimes they can be different. But we're really focused on just those set of constituents and, of course, the patient. So it allows us to just think about this triple aim all the time. How do you create something disruptive in a world where it's patients, providers, and payers? And so I think you just, I'm not sure that if we see, more than others, I think it's just that we see more or we take that perspective perhaps more than others. And so then it perhaps allows us to be more granular or sharpen the pencil and then make the right bets, related to that focus. So that's how I'd kind of characterize it.
No, it definitely makes sense. Being focused on an ecosystem that's so almost overwhelming, without even touching pharma or medical devices, just healthcare software alone.
Or direct to consumer, which is another, we don't do that. And so, I think it's in some ways, I really think, focus has helped us. Focus has allowed us to spend time in the areas in healthcare or digital health that we're most excited about. But then also I'll add one more element, which is, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it makes us like impact investors or mission, but there is mission sort of central to all of our companies because they are so focused on the area of healthcare that is care delivery and outcomes and spend, right? And so there is this like lovely element of mission and mission orientation to a lot of our companies, which I think we like.
Awesome. Well, I want to jump into your portfolio and talk about and have you highlight some of the reasons why you made the investments. You already mentioned one of them, but before I even ask that question, given that you're very focused on a particular set of tools and services and solutions in healthcare, do you feel like it might sometimes be limiting to invest in, say, either a general product that might encompass like a category like health management or telemedicine, or do you feel like there's a lot of space to play? Because I think for 406 Ventures, you make it very clear you don't invest in competing products with your own portfolio. So I'm curious on your perspective on this.
Yeah, sure. That's right. We try to make it one investment in a category, and then not again. So for example, we were sort of the Series A investors in a company called Iora Health, which delivers primary care, but to a specific population, Medicare Advantage population. But since making that investment, even though we've seen a number of other opportunities in and around primary care, we have not invested in them because we have, sort of the Iora bet. And we do that for a few reasons. I think the first is that companies ebb and flow. Where they start is never where they sort of can end up. And so we want to give our company sort of that full latitude and not feel like there's going to be conflict within the portfolio. I think the second part of it is when it forces you to be really thoughtful about the bet. If you're going to make one bet in a category, you better have a really thoughtful approach to it. And so I think we like that. It forces that level of rigor. And then the last thing on the flip side of that is you have to make it work then. You made the bet. This is your bet in primary care. You got to make it work. And so it all kind of hangs together with the strategy, which is, be thoughtful, make one bet in and around a space, and make it work. And so I think it sort of fits the puzzle pieces sort of fit together as you think about our overall fund strategy and only making a certain number of bets per fund. Now, we don't think that's limiting from an overall portfolio construction perspective. And in fact, I think it gives us, again, a little bit of helpful tunnel vision. It's like, okay, we made the investment in, cardiovascular space. Now let's move on. And there's so many spaces. Let's figure out what the right bet is in women's health or what it is in oncology. So it sort of gives us a nice forcing function to sort of move on. So I think those two parts of it hang together nicely, which is make the bet in a space and singularly and make it work, and then move on and find the next bet in the next key space. And I think that kind of it works for us right now.
Awesome. Oh, it definitely makes sense. And it feels like healthcare is a unique where you can invest in almost similar tools, but because they focus on different categories of health, it might not be too challenging. I'd love to highlight all of your portfolio because I think all your health portfolio is great, but I don't think we have enough time for it. So I'd love if you could highlight some of the companies that I think at least you're sitting on the board of. You already mentioned one of them, Heartbeat Health. You have Wellist, which is fantastic, Arista MD. Can you talk about, just highlight to the audience, one of the reasons why, what these companies do, but one of the reasons why you made some of these investments?
Sure, yeah. So we already spoke about Heartbeat, which we made that investment earlier this year. Talk about Arista, because that was the most recent investment that I made, which was done during COVID, actually. So it's evidence of sort of we're continuing to invest pretty actively in the pandemic. What Arista MD does is they allow primary care physicians to e-consult specialists around the care of their patients. And so when there's some sort of specific question related to a specialty need, the PCP can actually, ask a dermatologist or a hematologist or what have you. And instead of sending that patient over for a referral right away, the PCP can actually get that info and sort of further manage the patient at primary care and avoid unnecessary specialist referrals, which is actually really important for both the costs in the ecosystem, but also making sure that the right patients are seeing the right level of provider based on their acuity. And they sell to both payers and to health systems. So hospital systems use them to sort of e-consult internally. Payers use them to have their PCPs and network consult, and Arista MD has their own panel of specialists in that scenario. So this is a company we've been following for 3 years or so, and had sort of developed that thesis by getting to know them, but understanding that space better. And it just makes, even prior to COVID, it made a ton of sense to allow primary care physicians to be more empowered with this technology and this knowledge. And we were seeing that through the lens of Iora using e-consults, but then WellBe Health, which is one of our portfolio companies that takes care of frail elderly seniors, they're a PACE program. They're a customer of Arista MD. So that's how we originally got to know the company. And that's always a really helpful way to get validation. But it's been really useful for them. So we got excited about it because of the sort of strong ROI and value proposition, a terrific team, including the CEO, Brooke, a great female CEO, and then a terrific syndicate that we co-invested with that provided validation of sort of all of these strategic points. So Memorial Care Ventures, Cigna Ventures, and Ascension Ventures, all representing various strategics in the payer and health system landscape, also provided that sort of validation. So that's why we made that investment. But yeah, I mean, we could go on and on to others that you mentioned, like Wellist and Redox and others. But I think they all have sort of these common themes that I talked about with Arista, which is really strong value prop for either the payer or provider ecosystem or both. Hard dollar ROI, either manifest or one that you could sort of draw the map to. a really strong sort of founding or leadership team that understands this problem and, you know, lives, eats, breathes it. And then sort of, you know, kind of alignment with, you know, the, sort of really focusing on a particular, you know, it's less relevant to Arista, but more to some of our population specific, but really focusing on sort of that population in need so that you can really drive better outcomes and the cost savings. So you'll see a lot of these, you know, those are sort of the common themes across all of our investments.
Interesting. Yeah, and great, again, great portfolio. That's incredible. And actually, I kind of want to highlight on some of these companies and their point, especially like Arista MD. When we think about, you talked about the big focuses in healthcare services, but specifically, how do you work closer with payers, providers? When a lot of people think of telemedicine or healthcare services or health management, you know, right now we have a lot of direct to consumer and that the traditional like fee-based structure. And I'm just curious, what do you think is a practical or a sustainable business model for like these types of healthcare services? Because it feels like some people in the space might be struggling with having a fee-based model. Others seem to be doing fine, but it depends if you're direct to consumer or if you're selling to a payer. You know, so what is your take on this? What do you think is a great business model for healthcare services?
Sure. Yeah, and you know, I'll caveat by saying it depends, and it's also evolved over the last few years. But
it's a tough question.
Generally, for, you know, many of our companies, again, it comes back to, and this is why I'm so, you know, I feel like I'm beating sort of this drum, but this ROI is so important because that's what allows you to determine the pricing and command the pricing. So having that hard dollar ROI is so critical. So let's assume you have that. And I'd say the typical, you know, models have been, especially if you're payer facing, getting paid per member per month or PMPM. You know, if you're employer facing, per employee per month. That has been sort of a very, you know, sort of standard model. And then in some cases bearing risk or sharing in the risk additionally, I think has been another sort of, we've seen that evolution over the last few years that companies, you know, customers are now saying, okay, well, if you can really do what you say you do, then let's, you know, share in the upside. And then, but then also you're on the hook if it doesn't work as well. You know, I think another model that we've seen be very common, and this was the case with Able2, is now, you know, Heartbeat is sort of early and evolving, but is the case in Heartbeat as well, is sort of a case rate model, which is, you know, per episode or per engagement with the patient. So in some ways, a little bit of kind of the fee for service, but I wouldn't call it fee for service because it's aligned, it's based on sort of outcomes and value. So it's kind of this nice hybrid between what is a you know, a fee for service model and a value-based model. It's kind of saying, you know, you'll get paid every time a patient engages, but the patient's only going to engage because you've shown or are showing value. So that's another common thing. You know, when you're selling to the health systems, a lot of our companies that are selling to the health systems are more tech than they are services. So they're getting paid sort of either, you know, a utilization fee or a SaaS, you know, fee in the case of, you know, Redox or others. So, so I think that's why it really depends. But those are sort of the prevailing, you know, business models that we see across the portfolio.
Interesting. No, it definitely makes sense in that hybrid that you talked about towards on the latter part. And I'm also curious, what is, in your case, how do you think about what is the right tool to help manage specific health issues? This could be general chronic diseases or could be specific to diabetes. And by tool for the audience is it telemedicine? Is it device? Is it a health management application? Is it a, you know, a management tool for providers that is a good patient engagement tool? Like, how do you pick those apart and differentiate what is the right tool? Because it seems like there's a lot of overlap across all categories, trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be sort of lying to you if I said that we dictate it as much as sort of the founders and the teams come forth with a vision and we get the opportunity to sort of agree with that or not. So I'd say a lot of times we do defer to sort of our founding teams and the experts on this, but there are some characteristics of it that we think are important for it to succeed. The first is whatever modality you're going to use, it has to sort of fit within the existing workflow of either the provider or the payer. And if it's not quite within the workflow, or if it's going to require some unnatural act from them, like engaging a member and marketing to them and getting them to enroll in something, which is not something payers are really good at, you've got to do it. You've got to have that competency and have that be part of your modalities or what have you, and sort of have to think through that. So I think that's really important. And then again, it's as you add more, so a lot of companies say we're going to do sort of the whole gamut. We're going to do telehealth and remote patient monitoring, and we're going to have the hardware, we're going to do this, that, and the whole thing. But as you add each modality, there's cost, and there's sort of diffusion of focus. And so you've got to have some sort of, countervailing effect to that. There has to be some way to sort of offset those costs and all of that. So I think generally we'll find that our companies will narrow sort of their modality focus a lot more because of that reason, but also because it allows them to deliver better. Like, of course, if you could use every single modality and say, I can offer you the kitchen sink for this disease state, that would be great, but that's not really practical. So you will see that our companies will end up, picking one or two and really refining that sort of the ROI proposition. Because again, the more you can hone in and focus, the more you can really sort of deliver on the value proposition. And then, I think that the tide is also changing with sort of hardware. I mean, I feel like, several years ago, it was like, oh, no one wants to invest in anything that has sort of hardware associated with it. But in healthcare, we now sort of know, yeah, you've got to, there's got to be sort of more monitoring at home, remote monitoring. There's, hardware is some of the, enablement around even, virtual care, et cetera. So, but you just got to, it's got to fit within the business model and be sort of cleverly delivered. So, yeah, so I don't think I have sort of a precise mandate on how it should be done. I think I do, defer to the teams, but also make sure that it has sort of the right characteristics for how they're thinking about it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, because I think I think a lot of that will kind of emerge from the crowd, especially when talking with the founders about what is probably the right modality to start with.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, I'm curious, because it seems like your portfolio does kind of a combination of both, of building software or solutions or services that are specific to a disease and caring for that disease, versus a platform that kind of can be applied to a variety of different issues. How do you take that approach? Do you tend to be more disease specific, software focused, or healthcare services focused, or do you tend to look at healthcare software as something that can we apply this to a variety of different chronic conditions or a variety of different types of acute patients?
We're very much on the former, and telemedicine is a good example. We did not invest in any pure play telemedicine platform that was going to enable sort of telemedicine, because we thought that would get commoditized over time, and that it was much more interesting and harder actually to leverage telemedicine as part of the product against the specific disease state or a specific population. So instead, we invested in our first investment in around telehealth was with Able2, which was applying telemedicine towards behavioral health and providing a 8-week telemedicine administered behavioral health program and showing tremendous outcomes. And so telemedicine was a means to the end, which was showing tremendous outcomes for this behavioral health population. It was not the thing that was the company, right? And so there was tremendous value created at that company because they could show for this very large and important and meaningful population that they could move the needle with their set of technology and services, which included telemedicine. We've since invested in Heartbeat, which, as we mentioned, is the telemedicine for sort of a heart disease population. We also have a company that uses telehealth related to opioid use disorder and providing medication-assisted treatment. So a lot of our companies have telemedicine sort of infused, and we tend to think in those terms as opposed to investing in, for example, a telemedicine platform that could then, be applied or become the backbone for any of these things. I think it's just our sort of approach. But we have, in some occasions, done sort of the foundational technology, and I'd say Redox is a good example of that, sort of EMR interoperability across the board, enabling any digital health company to tie into an EMR. Abacus is another example. They're sort of working with payers on their data landscape and making sure that the disparate data sets can kind of come into a single source of truth and then be utilized across the board. So that's another sort of what I'd call an enabling technology. But I don't think those are sort of in commoditized spaces per se, because it's hard. What they're doing, what those folks are doing is hard technology, and a lot of IP around that.
Interesting. It definitely makes sense, especially this approach that you mentioned of being able to say focus on a little bit more focus on disease specific, because it's a service, and a service has to be able to show results, and having a tool to do that in a variety of different ways is great, but just a tool by itself doesn't mean it's going to provide better outcomes.
Right.
Very interesting. Well, I want to shift gears and talk generally market questions on healthcare. It seems as though, especially when talking with a lot of founders in the healthcare software space, is that it's really difficult to sell to providers, payers, et cetera. Sales cycle for healthcare software companies is notoriously much longer than most traditional enterprise software tools. I mean, how do you approach something like this? Like, what is your take on investing in healthcare software, especially knowing these caveats? And I know you talked about earlier that, and we're repeating this point again, you are very good at identifying companies that actually have impactful ROI, which probably speeds up that sales cycle. But
exactly, yeah.
You might be repeating this, but I'd love to get your take on this, on this
yeah,
challenge.
I think I think that's the, that point comes up again. I mean, I do think the sales cycle, the typical sales cycles in healthcare, like you said, can be 18 to 24 months. I mean, a whole startup can sort of die in that, sort of time frame. But also, there's also this other dynamic, which is death by pilots, for healthcare, which is like a lot of the health systems or payers will do a pilot with a company that will be unpaid or lightly paid, and you can that could be a pilot to nowhere, and that's another sort of valley of death for startups. So we are looking for elements that are going to counter that in our investment. So yeah, is there some element that truncates the sales cycle? So we talked about the ROI. And that's why it's critical for us to be having that ear to the ground around what's really important for the health systems or payers, because we know then you're going to be sort of in a buying mindset. Those customers are going to be in that buying mindset for the next sort of 2 to 3 years, because that will also help an early stage company, right? If it's something that's top of mind, it's a lot easier to get that seat at the table. So I think that's another element. And then, I mean, well, let's bring it back to sort of a people element. I mean, there are some teams that are really scrappy and good at sales and good at getting, leveraging their network, have the right network, use the right tools, and effectively get, in front of customers and communicate and deliver in a way that, that leads to good results. So I do think the team plays an important role in that. And that's why assessing the team, the time of our investment, is so important too, because, in an early stage company where you don't have a perfectly outlined sales organization, everyone is contributing to sales in some way, shape, or form. And so the team is so important. So I think those are a couple of the things that we haven't really talked about as much that are also important related to the sales cycle.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. And it's a hard problem, but it's your approach in being able to identify where's that sweet spot and how do you find those companies in that position that are good is interesting.
Yeah. And I think another thing that just came to mind, which is common sort of formula for our companies that Liam and I talk about, is getting that first sale or first 2 sales can be really hard. But once you have that, can you get the customer to sort of lock arms with you and either co-publish data on sort of the outcomes and the ROI? And if you can, that tends to be a really effective sales tool that accelerates the sales cycles moving forward. So a number of our companies have done that, which is sort of get the first customer that's buying because they are advanced in their thinking, or they're generally more favorable to startups, and then get them to sort of really publish and work with you on the data, and then use that as a sales tool. And that's been a really nice formula for many of our companies to sort of, kind of battle the sales cycles.
Interesting. Well, I'm curious on this question, because 406 Ventures is unique. You're not just healthcare investors. You have a great healthcare portfolio, but not just healthcare investors. You do, from my understanding, infrastructure. You also do cybersecurity. You're in enterprise software solutions.
Yeah.
In comparing healthcare at a macro level overall to these other categories like cybersecurity, healthcare has a lot lower exit ratios, which seems like it's a lot riskier to invest in as a whole. I mean, why did you guys make this decision to pursue healthcare and for venture investors versus going after categories like cybersecurity, which seems like it's a lot easier to achieve returns?
Yeah, we've had some great exits in our cybersecurity portfolio. But we've had some great exits in the healthcare portfolio as well. And I think that tide is changing. So there's no question that there's this sort of burgeoning opportunity in digital health. And I think part of that is not only at entry, but also at exit, because there are more companies that are going public. Payers are increasingly using their sort of checkbooks and their balance sheet to make acquisitions. And we've seen that in our portfolio. There is more sort of non-healthcare companies, like the tech companies, right, of the world, the big public ones that are making acquisitions in healthcare. And so I really do think that it's the right sort of characteristics for a very healthy and ripe exit market at really strong multiples, which we've experienced in our portfolio and that we are really bullish on for the future of our portfolio. I would say generally, exits are hard, whether it's cyber or healthcare, another segment. So that's why we stick to first principles. You've got to build a good company, and the good company has got to have, certain characteristics and foundational elements, and that will scale and it will be attractive, to either be a standalone company, a public company, or more likely than not, in our experience, be acquired. And so our view has been, and look, we're 15 years in, so we've had our exits are accelerating over the last couple funds, and I think we're just sort of on that precipice where we're starting to, we're going to have more and more. So I think time will tell, but we we're sort of bullish on the exit opportunities for our companies. But at the end of the day, we focus more on building the good companies where they are right now, just so that they have optionality in the future.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is exactly why I wouldn't have this conference or invite you to this conference and have you speak, because not only it's a bold move to look at a variety of other industries, including and take on healthcare as you are, but being able to showcase that you are extremely focused and being able to show that you've proved out the model. You have exits in your portfolio. You're going to have more exits in the future in an industry that's overwhelming with the number of companies. So it's really impressive. I'm curious though, and this might, I don't know if this has changed your perspective on healthcare overall over the past 15 years, but how has the pandemic really changed your outlook on healthcare?
For us at 406, the pandemic underscored many of our theses and philosophies, which was, and so I think it's been helpful to our portfolio because, we invested in most of our companies were pre-pandemic, right, obviously, and most of our companies experienced tailwinds. And so it just suggests that sort of the way that we were thinking about it and where the puck is moving was validated by COVID. And COVID, while there's all the unfortunate negative impacts of COVID, of course, what it's done in healthcare is it's sort of accelerated, virtual care, adoption of technology, making things more efficient. It's accelerated all of that like a decade. you
Mm.
know, and so that's been the one I'd say helpful outcome of COVID, at least in healthcare, is that it's provided an accelerating force for many of those themes and topics that our portfolio companies were already focused on. So it's made, I think it's provided some clarity in healthcare. It's also, in some ways, these types of events always kind of help you say, okay, like what's important and what's not. And I think it's provided that level of clarity too for us and other investors, which is like, at the end of the day, this has all got to be about, good patient care and improving outcomes and being able to work in sort of an evolving and changing landscape and environment and being resilient to what changes may come in the future too. Yeah, so that's sort of, kind of my observations from COVID. For us, it's really, I think, just further validated that we were thinking about things in the right way, and we're going to continue to invest with the same sort of lens that we have been.
Interesting. Yeah, it definitely has this feeling that it's really highlighted the bottlenecks across the entire healthcare ecosystem and really made everyone think hard about those problems in a big way.
Yeah.
With that, that was most of the questions I had regarding just the healthcare ecosystem as a whole. I wanted to focus and zero in on 406 Ventures because I think what makes you guys very unique is you already highlighted it, your focus and your dedication to the portfolio companies that you're investing into. But you seem like you guys are very, very hands-on in making sure these companies are a success. And I think that gives 406 Ventures a huge competitive advantage in the entire ecosystem. So I'm just curious if you can highlight some of the unique aspects of 406 Ventures in that regard.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's very much part of our DNA is, to take a board seat with every investment, or even or an active board observer seat if that's what makes sense, and just really be in the trenches with our companies. I think we like to say we like to be the first call in good times, but we like to be the first call in bad times too. And I think that's an earned position. It's not sort of a right for an investor. And I think we've earned that across our portfolio. And why? I think it's because we, I like to say a third of the time we know the right answer right away. A third of the time we have enough experience and, to be able to kind of give the right answer. And then a third of the time we're willing to sort of roll up our sleeves and work through it with our companies. It's not, and just sort of that approach, and having, the experience and the right answers most of the time, I just think that makes us helpful, and just the willingness to want to do it. Yeah, and I think, you could talk to any one of our portfolio companies, and in the ways that we've helped have been so disparate and different across the portfolio, but we have to be able to help with everything from recruiting to, company building to scaling product to how do you think about, your board decks to fundraising to marketing to, you name it, to acquisitions to being acquired to, and so I think we enjoy that, and we enjoy that level of partnership with our companies, but we also just think it, it leads to better outcomes. So yeah, so I do think that's part of our brand, but the strategy has to hang together with it. So that means we don't make a ton of investments because we need the bandwidth that each, partner has to be able to provide that level of partnership to, his or her company. So we try to make sure that our whole strategy hangs together with that philosophy.
Awesome. Well, with that, Payal, this is great. I mean, that's all the questions I had for you. I mean, we're right on time. I'm happy we got to go through everything. It's really interesting to see your perspective, not only your approach on your investment thesis, but highlight some of the awesome portfolio companies that you have, your outlook on the entire healthcare ecosystem and how the pandemic affected that. This has been really great. And before I close out, is there anything that you wanted to ask of the audience or announce or anything that you wanted to add?
Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. And if you're a founder, starting an enterprise health company or where I can be helpful, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope this was helpful.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Payal. I really appreciate taking time. This was really
Kyle.
great.
I appreciate that.